morning, everyone. Welcome to Denton's. We're delighted that you've joined us today for our 2-hour CLE event on allyship and then on protecting confidentiality. Ron, I'll turn it over to you.
Before Ron begins, I need to read a few housekeeping notes for the CLE purposes.
Yes.
For the benefits of all participants. Oh, I have to read my portion first, Susan.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. For the benefit of all participants, attendee lines have been muted. Should you have any questions that you would like to submit during the event, you may submit them through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If we cannot address your question during today's webinar, we will follow up with this after the program. Please note that today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to all registrants via email after the event. Should you have follow-up questions at that time, please reach out to any of the key contacts listed in the email communication. Note, Denton's can only issue CLE credit for attendees during the live broadcast of the webinar. The following is a very important message regarding CLE credit. The webinar window must remain open for the entirety of the program, and it must be only the window forefront of your screen. WebEx will detect if you minimize the program or use the computer outside the webinar software, and this will prevent you from earning CLE credit. One other note, if you have a New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas City license, please be sure to listen for the code word given during the program. When prompted, you will need to enter the code word into the Q&A section of the screen. If you do not have a license in these states, you can disregard this message. Now I will turn it over to Susan to begin our program.
I'll turn it over to Ron.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining with us today. You see the presenters in front of you now, and you see our full bios available at the various links. I don't plan to go through those in any great detail and spend instead the time on the substance we're talking about of allyship. If we go to the next slide, Susan, unless one of you would like to comment a little bit about yourselves. Karen?
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Karen Jordan, I'm the managing partner of the St. Louis office of Denton's, and I am in the corporate group.
Mukul?
Thanks, Ron. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mukul Kelker. I am a senior managing associate here in Houston, Texas, and I'm in the commercial litigation space.
Susan?
I am Deputy General Counsel at Denton's, and for many years before I joined the Office of General Counsel, I was a litigator specializing in government contracts.
Well, again, thank you for all being with me today, and thank you to everyone who's listening to us. So let's talk about allyship. I want to spend a little time talking to you about the concept and about the faculty. We've done that already. I'm looking forward to this next hour that we're going to be together to talk about a number of issues that we as attorneys should think about. We're thinking about some topics that I think it's fair to say are front and center in the practice of law and with our clients that we have today, and those of you listening in. So with that, here's the introduction. We're going to be talking about the concept of allyship. We're going to be talking, interestingly, on the model rules of professional conduct and how those relate to allyship. Discuss about using the model rules to further inclusion and diversity, which obviously is an important topic for us today. And last, some closing thoughts and observations from everyone. So if we go to the next slide. Let's talk about what an ally is. This is maybe a hard topic to wrap your mind about. An ally is someone pretty simple, social group who enjoys a privilege of some kind, but wants to avoid marginalization of others. And I'll leave it to the others to comment in a minute about privileged social groups and marginalization just as we get started. An ally is someone who speaks out for others, stands up for others, who understands that there may be uncomfortable situations that we're all in at times. And last, trying to bring about positive change. So I'm going to ask each of you for 1 minute. Privileged group, and what does it mean to help marginalization, ending that, just as a general concept? So Susan, let me start with you.
I am very privileged in many ways. I am white. I had the great fortune to have come from a loving home. I joined a law firm that was full of allies, because when I started practicing law, which was in 1980, there really weren't very many women in management or partnership in law firms. And the men at my firm were great allies. They supported me, they taught me, they had my back. And that allyship meant everything to me in progressing as a lawyer.
Okay. Kamal?
Ron, I think you're talking to me, right?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry.
Oh, cool. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize.
No worries, no worries. Right. No, I'm glad to talk about the concept of allyship. I think that just to pull the curtain back a little bit, I don't think growing up, I grew up in North Dallas, in a pretty conservative part of Texas. I don't think I necessarily always bought in, or I wasn't sure whether diversity and inclusion was being executed properly or effectively where we were. But over time, I've come to really appreciate the value of what allyship means, and especially with the idea of giving voice to the voiceless, speaking out for others that may not have a voice themselves, and inviting people to boardrooms and tables and meetings where the big decisions are happening. And so I view allyship as a place where there's a lot of undiscovered talent that may not have gone to the right school, or may not have been in a place where there's structurally a lot of power afforded to them. And it's important as allies to extend our hand to make sure that those people get the opportunity, because there's going to be a lot of untapped talent that gets discovered in that process as well.
Well, before we go further, let me ask you a follow-up question. How do you discover the undiscovered talent?
Yeah, that's right. So what I would say is that sometimes let's put it this way, maybe the metrics that are used right now are not always they're not always perfect, right? So I'll give you an example. I think that you may say it might be easy just from the outside looking in, hey, let's just line up everybody's SAT scores and call it a day, and we'll take the top 10 best SAT scores, and that'll probably be it. Well, there may be a little bit of context depending on background experiences that somebody has had that may give a little more color and context to what appear to be sort of objective metrics, right? And so I think the way to discover this undiscovered talent is understand that, well, just to put finer numbers on it, and using SAT scores as an example, a 1400 for somebody that comes from a broken family in very tough conditions is probably more impressive than a 1450 that comes from somebody with every luxury handed to them, right? And so it's by zooming out a little bit and understanding not just sort of the objective metrics, but the sort of harder to define metrics as to how somebody got there, that you may find some untapped potential.
Karen, concept of allyship as a general proposition, your thoughts?
Yeah. So one thing I can say about allyship and being an ally is you could be on different sides of the table depending on the context in which you're speaking about being an ally. I've had, as like Susan pointed out, I've been the beneficiary of a lot of allies who have helped me along the way with my career and in education and in life, but then I've also been in a position to be an ally to others. So when we talk about marginalization, I am a woman of color. So those are two groups that have been historically marginalized, but I'm also highly educated. I grew up in a loving home. I was born in America. I speak the native language. And so there are a lot of ways that I am able to be an advocate and an ally for people. But depending on the context, I have been the beneficiary of allies who've helped me find a place. And I think that the acknowledgement that everyone has a different lived experience, I feel like is the heart of being an ally. Is just that understanding. And I think that McCool made a point and talked about educational experiences and standardized tests. And I think that just acknowledging lived experiences are different for different people is I think that is the first step in becoming an ally.
It's fair to say from what everyone said that we all bring different experiences to the table. And I expect the most important thing, this concept of allyship, is understanding what we bring and understanding how others may want to bring things and has some difficulties because of factors that have been present over time and the like, and that may be unconscious for some of us. But the concept of allyship really is helping out, I think, more than anything else, but being prepared to understand when you should be helping and working out. And Susan, I don't know if you have a thought, and then we can move on to the next slide if you want.
Nope.
Okay, why don't we go to the next slide? Just continuing on the concept and generally some questions to ask. What roadblocks are there to be an effective ally? And what different ways are there to be an ally? Roadblocks might be uncomfortableness in making some comment about something. It also could be shyness, not willing to not rock the boat, just even to stand out and the like. Although I think it's fair to say, and Karen, I see you are nodding, a willingness to understand where you're coming from at the beginning and still accept that you need to say or do something at different times at a minimum. Would that be right?
I think that's right. And then not knowing what to say. And I think that a lot of times people struggle with being an ally because they are like you see their mind racing about what they could possibly say, but they feel like they missed their opportunity. And I think I've sort of had a lot of experiences, what I would call like the imperfect ally or the imperfect advocate, because they weren't sure about what they should say, but they knew that they should say something. And I think that people are always afraid of saying the wrong thing. And I think that it's often a fair fear, but as you mentioned, being uncomfortable at times is also at the heart of being an ally, that this is meant to get you out of your comfort zone and also increase or expand your comfort zone.
Well, is it fair to say that we as lawyers, especially litigators, probably are in situations where we're uncomfortable a number of times presenting or responding or listening?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. And I think that there's, in the litigator context, there's so much pressure to obviously deliver the end result for the client that it's sort of this may seem like sort of a secondary aspect to it, right? In terms of do like the whole concept of being an ally, how do you do that while simultaneously effectuating a good result for your client, for instance, right? But we all know that studies have shown that people with diverse opinions or diverse teams provide much better solutions and provides for much more innovation. And so getting back to sort of the business case about it, it is in fact beneficial, not an added chore to a group to engage in allyship and to reach out to different to equip your team with people that may not look like you or may not come from the same walks of life. I loved Karen's expression of it, the lived experiences, right? Bringing different lived experiences to the table will help make you a better team overall. And
Susan, before we move on, how about that, putting a team together? Any thoughts about that?
I do. I think many of us wrestle with issues of unconscious bias. So it's important to look within and look without. So make sure that you are seeing people for their potential as well as their current qualities, and recognize that, first of all, we have a moral and ethical obligation to be allies. Secondly, as Mukul said, it's the business case for allyship is that more diversity on your team is going to get you better people over time and expand their opportunities.
Michael, what else would you like to say about the concept of allyship?
well, yeah, I was about to jump in on something here. You know, because I knew that we were going to be talking about the allyship concept, and I was wrestling with what sort of the effective way to explain this in a litigation context. Let me just give you an example of this that we had in the last year, where we were dealing with litigation concerning a restaurant that serves like a you know, not the best part of Houston, right? It's not the most financially viable part of Houston, right? And so then the idea was that the restaurant may have to operate 2 blocks to the east, right? And in Houston, that may be like a quarter mile or a third of a mile, right? Maybe a 10-15 minute walk in Houston. And so the court internally, everybody was struggling with, well, what's the big deal if this restaurant is moved a quarter mile to the east, right? I mean, Houston's a commuter town. Everybody drives. It's not like Chicago with an integrated public transit system. And the answer is that the people, both the employees and the customer base that that go to this particular restaurant, they rely on public transit. That restaurant was built right next to a bus stop, right? And so if that restaurant is moved, you know, a half mile away, then you're basically posing an existential threat to the operations because you're relying on a customer base and an employee base that cannot afford a car, right? And so, and in a place like Houston. And so when we're all lawyers here and maybe people who are lucky enough to be in that position where those sorts of hurdles don't present themselves, that may not be a problem that's easily apparent to a privileged class. But if you are willing to reach out, or if an organization is to reach out to people with different lived experiences, you may have somebody on your team who has gone through that who has gone through that time, right? Who has gone through the experience of living in a place like Houston where you have to rely on public transit, for instance, right? And it is that diversity of idea that can provide a more compelling solution. And it was used quite effectively in our case, right? When we were able to point that out. But it may not be something that's not immediately realized unless you have a sort of diverse group that is able to bring those shared experiences to the table.
Sounds like you need a village to make decisions and something like that.
Yeah, sometimes, right? Right, or at least a village of opinions for sure, with somebody who's willing to listen to them.
Karen?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with that. I think just understanding and thinking big picture. I think that being an ally helps you also see big picture, even though you're helping a uh, amplify a voice of a marginalized group, you're actually also helping yourself see the big picture of things.
Susan, should we go to the next slide? Karen, why don't you tell us a little bit about microaggression?
Yeah, and microaggression, I think, is a word that we've all heard a lot of. We've all heard it a lot, but a lot of times we're not quite sure what it means. And the term microaggression was actually created in the 1970s by a Black Harvard professor and psychiatrist who had studied stereotypical representations of Black people in the media. So microaggressions are comments or other behaviors that indirectly express a stereotype of a marginalized group, whether or not the aggressor intends to express this bias or prejudice. And microaggressions express sexism, racism, homophobia, and other oppressive behaviors at an interpersonal level. As the term microaggression suggests, the comments by the aggressor are brief, and they are just in an everyday environment. But however brief and commonplace, they communicate hostility, insulting and derogatory messages, and they reinforce stereotypes. So we've all heard microaggressions, and some examples of microaggressions are if you're speaking to a person who is gay or transgender, speaking about their quote lifestyle as though a person's sexual orientation or gender identity is considered a choice rather than part of who they are. That sort of comment marginalizes a person and reinforces that they don't belong. If you're talking to a person from a marginalized race, the declarative statement of "I am colorblind" can often feel like it's denying a person's personal or cultural experience. And then the classic form of microaggression is telling a joke that is a thinly veiled insult, but when called on it, sort of double down on it. And you're like, oh, you can't take a joke. I didn't mean any harm. I'm just being, it's just a joke. You're taking things too seriously. You're a little sensitive, aren't you? That sort of thing. And those are microaggressions. And even though they are microaggressions, they're not micro problems. And people in marginalized groups are recipients of hostility and stereotyping all of their lives. In fact, Ibram Kendi, who is a National Book Award winner and director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research, once said, "A persistent daily low hum of racist abuse is not minor." And it's not. Microaggressions are a form of abuse. They reinforce overt aggression that marginalized people have experienced over their lives. And a lot of time it is because they're because they're small insults. It's almost like death by a thousand cuts instead of just, one, stab. And they're often, the feeling that people in marginalized groups get is often dismissed as, well, at least it's not fill in the blank, something that is terrible and overtly racist or sexist or homophobic. And it is, if you've ever heard a person from a marginalized group say, they're just exhausted, I think a lot of times it is from dealing with microaggressions. And research has even shown that the cumulative effect of microaggressions can contribute to a hostile work environment, lower productivity, and it can contribute to anxiety and depression or other physical problems like insomnia, can reduce self-esteem, and also devalue social group identities. And I think a lot of times expressing how you feel about a microaggression, what can be described as a microaggression, is met with sometimes an eye roll, or can't you just let that go, or that sort of thing. And it's really not it's not fair to the target of the microaggression.
Well,
Yeah, so, to that point, I mean, Karen, I just love the way you describe that, right? So, I mean, if you're on the outside listening into this, it may just sound like it's a passing 5-minute instance that may happen to somebody, right? But the point is that for the recipient of the microaggression, it's 5 minutes every day, maybe multiple times a day for their entire life, right? So it can build up over time, right? And so the easiest way I explain it from my perspective or my experience is. So I'm South Asian. I have very rarely had, I can probably count on one hand, thankfully, the times of like horrible instances of racism that have been directed my way, but sort of the micro examples of it, though, I can't count at all because they've happened so often, right? So I mean, I don't think I've ever even explained my math skills where somebody has said, "Hey, McCool, I need you for your math skills right now," right? I mean, it's like I'm a lawyer with an English degree, right? But I still find myself in that position. I think a great example that I've talked about, we were in allyship pods earlier this year. A great example is, and I wasn't even sure if this was a microaggression or not when I experienced it, but you go to a restaurant and you order soup, right? And I was on I think it was date night with my wife, and I had soup at the start of the meal, and our server says, "Hey, just so you know, there's bacon in that soup," and it's like, I know what's in this soup. I know what I'm ordering, and so there's this long discussion that we had that said I had with my wife that said, look, I mean, they're just looking out for us. What's the big deal? I mean, is this even an issue? But there are times where I'm not even aware of my race, but it's obvious that the person I'm interacting with is aware of it, and they're shaping their experience around that. And so, is there anything offensive to it? Probably not. They meant well. But at the same time, when I've asked my non-South Asian friends that whether they've been ever warned, hey, there's soup and there's bacon in that soup, it doesn't happen as often, And so it's a lot of tiny stories that don't necessarily, in an individual context, amount to anything, but in the long run, they most certainly do.
Yeah,
Aaron,
and I
here's
think
a great, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just
I
going
was
to say, McCool pointed out to something that I think when you are trying to move from being a bystander to an ally when you observe a microaggression is assuming that you assume that the microaggression is not intentional. And it is something that, so it's best to, if you're trying to interrupt this, that instead of trying to get into a back and forth or trying to score points against someone, how do you actually not just be a bystander and just let it go, but actually speak up and speak out about it and take some sort of action? I think the first thing is to assume that it was not intentional. But go ahead, Ron. You wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to ask you, when you do observe a microaggression, number one, you have to recognize it. And if you're not the person who is the subject of the microaggression, I suppose that's one question, one thought. But then when you recognize it, is there an optimum way to say, you shouldn't say that, or you shouldn't presume this?
So I think if you're observing it, in addition to just sort of start with the assumption that it was not intentional and focus on the event and not the person, you want to help the aggressor understand how their behavior was hurtful or problematic, but then you also want to show the target that you're an ally. And also use your emotional intelligence and actively listen, which can be difficult because what we're doing here is we want to be allies and not saviors. So you need to listen and use your emotional intelligence with respect to the target, because people will react different ways. And sometimes they are, asking you to pull back, or they don't want to see a big confrontation, but they want you to speak up. So I think just using that, just play it by ear and amplify the voice of the marginalized person instead of kind of coming in and trying to save the day, and expect to be uncomfortable. As we've already talked about, being an ally sometimes means getting out of your comfort zone. And I think some things that you could say, you could talk privately to the aggressor, pull them to the side. An example would be, when you told Tim he didn't sound gay, you might have meant that as a compliment, but sounding gay is a long-standing stereotype that makes gay people feel like they're not accepted. Or when you compliment someone on their English in front of a group because they speak with a slight accent, now you're just pointing out that they are different from the group. And I think it's making sure that you also let the victim know how you feel. Acknowledge that what someone said was inappropriate. If you feel like you cannot call out, sometimes it is difficult or impossible to objectively call out the aggressor in real time. And when that happens, you just let the victim know that you support them, that you acknowledge that what was inappropriate, and see if there's anything that you could do following that interaction. But also a couple of just stock responses. Somebody said something, question them on it, kind of disarm them. Like, what made you say that? Or, I don't get the joke. Can you explain it to me? And it sort of disarms the aggressor in real time. And then also, just to put it out there, because I think we've all probably been guilty of ourselves committing a microaggression, to acknowledge it, apologize sincerely. A terrible example of an apology would be, I'm sorry, Alicia. I know women are sensitive. That's just another microaggression. A better apology would be, I'm sorry, Alicia. I know the joke was inappropriate and I should not have told it. So there's a couple of things that we can say in real time, and a couple things that we can say and do after the interaction has occurred.
Thank you. Why don't we go ahead to talk about bias for a few minutes? I expect if I was going to poll a number of people listening in today, that one of the biggest concerns anyone has is bias. Bias, pretty simple and straightforward. It's a prejudice based on something against a person or thought or whatever, and you can explicitly be biased or intentionally conscious, or it can be unconscious. And it sounds to me, Karen, this may be back to you, and I'm going to ask the others. Bias is a broader set, if you will, of microaggressions, or do they overlap? Are they distinct?
I think both. I think both of those things are true. They do overlap and they are a bit distinct. Everyone has biases. I think that it's not, they are shortcuts in our mind to do things, and how we sort of make a snap judgment about things. So I think that everyone has biases. That is just human nature. It is what you do with your biases, whether you recognize them. Everyone, even though microaggressions are products of bias, it's a behavior that comes from biases. But I think what we really want to do is just make sure that we interrupt them when that we question ourselves, when we find ourselves making snap judgments about people, places, and things. That I think that everybody has biases. It's just what you do with them. That's sort of an oversimplification of that.
And let's go to the next slide and ask the big question. Similar to the question I asked you, Karen, how do you move from being a bystander to an ally when you observe it? So, Susan, what do you think? How do we move from watching to doing?
Well, first of all, being an ally is all about standing up and speaking up. So as Karen said, in the moment, it may not be appropriate or useful to call somebody out on what is clearly bias. But I think as an ally, you certainly take them aside privately as soon as you can and say, I was kind of offended by that remark. And I'm sure you're not aware of it. As Karen said, assume the best about people. And for the target of the bias, we don't want to be saviors. We want to listen to people and find out what they want us to do, if anything. So I would talk to the person and say, I don't know about you, but I was offended when Joe said that. And I wondered how you felt about it or how you thought about it. And listen and see what they say. And then depending on what they say, you might offer to speak with Joe if they would be comfortable with that, or report it to HR if they would be comfortable with that. But I think the important element of being an ally is doing what the target wants you to do.
What if the target doesn't know what he or she wants you to do?
Talk about it. Give them some options. See what they say. As Karen said, use your emotional intelligence. You're there to stick up for people, to be a mentor, to be an ally, to be a friend.
And I think it's fair to say through all this that as we're being an ally, as you said, and we're standing up, we're, I think, hoping to improve everyone's lot who might be involved in the situation or maybe within an organization. Could that be?
Absolutely. The Joe in my example probably doesn't want to be a biased person, and the organization doesn't want, or I should say, it's never a perfect world. We had a session, actually a workshop on allyship yesterday in my office, and they talked about the 15% solution, that a 15% improvement in an organization in allyship can make a huge difference. So as an organization, we want to identify bias when we see it and do something about it.
Well, thoughts before we move on to our next topic.
Yeah, and just to pick up on what, sorry, can you guys hear me still? Yeah, okay. Sorry, just to pick up on what Susan was saying, if somebody has, engaged in some questionable conduct, the likelihood that they're going to be, depending on the severity, but I mean, the likelihood that they're going to get their stuff, boxed up and walked out of the office, like in the next 15 minutes, is pretty low, which means that the goal then is to come up with some sort of, nurturing, make it an opportunity to educate. Let's put it that way. And so don't go into it trying to score points against that person, but try to sort of bring them out from whatever rock they're under to say, hey, look, that joke isn't funny, and here's why. And we've talked about it being uncomfortable. It will be uncomfortable, and that's okay. You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet sometimes, and so it unfortunately may fall on the allies, which typically then means people not necessarily of a dominant race or gender, but the whole point of being an ally is to expand that group of people that are standing up against that sort of bigotry.
So let's talk about covering for a minute, if we could, Susan.
Yes, there's an excellent book on covering by Kenji Yoshino, a gay Japanese legal scholar at NYU, member of the faculty. The book is called Covering: The Hidden Assault on Our Civil Rights. It's part scholarly article and part memoir. It's an excellent book, got great reviews. I recommend it to everybody. He describes covering as any activity used to tone down a disfavored identity in order to fit into the mainstream. He breaks those activities into 4 categories: appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association, which are useful subcategories because they help us recognize behavior. So for example, an appearance-based covering might be, when I was a young partner, I worked with an associate who had in his non-work life an earring in one ear and long hair. But when he was in the office, he took out the earring, managed to get that long hair into a ponytail that he discreetly hid under his collared shirt. That's covering. Affiliation-based covering are behaviors designed to avoid being labeled with a stereotype. So for example, a woman who has children, hopefully not as much these days, but certainly when I was a young partner, might avoid talking about children in the office because she doesn't want to play into the stereotype that she is less committed to the job or that she's less available to work hard. Advocacy-based covering is when an employee actively avoids other members of the group to which they belong. So for example, if you are Republican in an office full of avid Democrats, you might avoid discussions in groups of politics, of the elections, for fear of being labeled in these charged political days, the labels that both parties throw at each other. And finally, there's association-based covering, in which workers actively avoid members of their group, such as when a gay employee does not bring her significant other to an office function. But in general, covering is always about avoiding the stigma of not being part of the majority group. We can't change our skin, can't change our color, religion, but we can alter how we act. And covering is a way that people engage in what Professor Yachino calls a bias towards assimilation. Assimilation is a good concept in some contexts, but not in the workplace. People believe, often correctly, that people who fit in with the mainstream are more likely to get promoted, more likely to get opportunities, more likely to get good reviews. That's destructive to people when they feel like they have to avoid their authentic selves in the workplace in order to just do their job.
Would you like to chat a little bit about our next topic?
Competence?
Yes.
Okay. Cultural competence. I'm a great person to talk about this because I grew up outside a city in Minnesota where everybody was white. Not only was everybody white, but everybody was of Scandinavian descent and everybody was Lutheran. There were a few token Catholics, but it was a very, very homogeneous upbringing. It wasn't until I moved to Los Angeles when I started working as a lawyer that I actually encountered people of color. Even in law school, we didn't have people of color. So when I started my career, I was about as culturally incompetent as anyone you've ever met. There's a big difference between cultural diversity in a workplace and cultural competence. Cultural diversity is having a variety of ethnic, cultural, religious people in an organization, but having a diverse workforce doesn't mean that the company or the people are competent culturally in understanding those diverse groups of people. So cultural competency is when an organization has a set of principles, systems, and attitudes about cultural differences and cultural experiences, and they put those principles, systems, and attitudes into action. Cultural competence, in fact, is at the heart of managing diversity. Most of us, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, religion, have to work developing cultural competence. That means taking stock of our own personal biases and prejudices, learning from our mistakes, committing to learn about people who are different from us, and committing to being an ally, both interpersonally and institutionally. McCool earlier referred to the business case of allyship. There's an outfit called Change Catalyst, which specializes in allyship. They conducted an online survey in 2020 of 1,625 people from 20 different industries. They found that people who have allies who are diverse are approximately twice as likely to be satisfied with their job, be satisfied with the workplace culture, and feel like they belong. Twice as likely. That's huge.
Karen, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about intersectionality and what that means and how that impacts what we're talking about.
Well, intersectionality, and this is going to be a mouthful here, is a qualitative analytic framework that was developed in the late 20th century that identifies how interlocking systems of power affect those who are marginalized in society. So intersectionality is used as an allyship concept to describe the ways in which systems of inequality are based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, other forms of discrimination that intersect to create overlapping effects. And it's it can affect the intensity or the frequency of someone's experience with microaggression and other instances of bias. For example, an Asian transgender woman might be denied a job because of her gender identity, her race, or both. To put it differently, the concept of intersectionality recognizes that, for example, white women are sometimes the victim of gender bias, and men of color sometimes suffer from racial bias. However, both of those experiences of those two groups of people differ from the experiences of women of color, because women of color experience both gender and racial bias. So some other examples of intersectionality are disability and sexuality, gender or race and nationality. So it really is it's understanding that all individuals are different and they experience different things differently. That's a kind of a very short way of describing the concept.
So is there a focus for a person when they're dealing with intersectionality?
Well, I think that one of the things we have to do, I've talked about human nature. As human beings, we need to resist the impulse to simplify what are truly complex situations. And we have to question our preconceived notions and recognize our own implicit biases and use our emotional intelligence. I actually think that a lot of being an ally and a lot of addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is about using our emotional intelligence and actually establishing lines of communication and relationships with people. As Susan talked about cultural competence, it's important that we make the effort to understand how people are different from us, even if it has not been our experience in the past.
Any thoughts before we start talking about how the rules of professional conduct may relate to all this?
I have a very important thought. At this point in the presentation, members of our audience who are licensed in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas must type the code word ally, A-L-L-Y, ship, into the Q&A box, which is in the lower right-hand quadrant of your screen. Please make sure to hit the send button after you do that, so it registers. You need that in order to get credit. So we'll take 30 seconds here for everybody to get that done. Again, people from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Kansas need to do this. Everybody else does not need to.
So I think we're seeing these allyship code words coming in the Q&A, but just so everybody knows, the chat box is available also. If you guys have things you want to, tack on to what we're saying, or if we're missing a big point, by all means, feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A to reach out to us and everybody else.
While we're waiting, somebody just typed in a question. What do you do if you're putting together a team and the team leader says, I need the best talent for this team, and Mary just isn't there, but she has a lot of talent, and you think that person is being biased? What do you do?
All right, well, I'll jump in if that's all right. I think that as initial, I think, let's just take our firm, for instance, or our organization, right? If you're at the firm, you're probably good enough, right? It's table stakes. Being excellent at your job is table stakes in order to make it to function and survive at a firm, right? So then, when it comes to, well, who do we need for this particular job? This is the uncomfortable aspect of allyship a little bit, which is to say, hey, look, we're going to bring this person up to speed. If in your world you believe this person isn't up to speed, as an ally, you can advocate for the person and bring and insist on that person being there. It's okay to do that. It's okay to have that awkward conversation in order to bring somebody on. It's not, and you are sort of fighting against a current of human emotion that says, well, I want people that look and act like me to be on the team. But this is where allyship can really shine in terms of advocating and even at the risk of making it a tough, tense conversation, saying that this other person should come on and remind that whoever is sort of insisting on a particular person that because they are in the organization already, that they're already eminently qualified.
And I think take that as an opportunity to look at what are you not doing in order to invest in people to make sure that they are, that you're getting the best and highest use. I will often say, and I think this is something that Will Smith said, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. And I think a lot of times it is one of those things that sometimes people aren't putting forth diverse teams unless somebody asks for it. And I think that we're thinking about this the wrong way. Yeah, there's a business case for diversity and reducing unconscious bias, but there's a business case for just making sure that you're developing all of your talent. And it doesn't matter if a person asks you for a diverse team, you should be developing and pouring into and investing in your entire team. So that's not even something in your mind that comes up as well, this person better or that person's better. It's your diverse talent is not there just to be diverse talent. They are talent. And so I think that when things like that arise, when you find yourself questioning that, I think you have to look at what you're doing and how you can make it so that that's not even a question that pops up, so that you're always putting forth and investing in diverse teams. I get that people have that, and it takes a long time to combat sort of the structure of things, but I think it's primarily a structural issue that you need to look at what you're doing in order to make sure that you are investing and pouring into all of your resources within an organization.
Those are great points, and you must have read the next slide. Some of you in the audience may be thinking, do these people just shoehorn the model rules into the presentation on allyship in an effort to get CLE ethics credit for us? Actually, no, there's a fair amount of interplay between the model rules and allyship. Rule 1.1 says that a lawyer or a law firm, rules treat every assembly of lawyers as a law firm, shall provide competent representation to a client, and that requires, among other things, legal knowledge and skill. So there are important corollaries to Rule 1.1 in the comments. First, a lawyer need not have specialized training or prior experience in order to handle problems that the lawyer is unfamiliar with. Second, in determining whether a lawyer is competent for a given matter, one consideration is whether the lawyer can associate in or consult with a lawyer who does have the requisite training or experience. So how does a lawyer become competent? By getting opportunities to learn, to work with another lawyer who has the right experience in an area. If we don't give diverse lawyers opportunities to participate in a pitch, to be on the big case, to have face time with the client or the boss, how are they going to become as competent as they can be? And not only have studies shown that fostering a more inclusive, supportive workplace increases job satisfaction, it encourages people to step out of their comfort zone and stretch as lawyers. And that way they become better lawyers. When we don't do that, people leave. Good, talented people leave our organizations, and we lose great assets that we fail to recognize and support in their efforts to get greater competence. All right, one more time. All right, turning over to you, Ron.
This is, I think, part and parcel of allyship. A supervisory attorney or partner has some obligations. And if you look at B, when we're talking about reasonable efforts to ensure that other lawyers conform to the rules, that means partners, supervisors have to be familiar with their surroundings, with the associates they work with, associates and non-lawyers who you work with, to see that people are being competent and we are making the best use of resources that we can and bringing a team together and dealing with some things that might make the team not function as well as it could, to me, is an ethical side of allyship. So, Susan, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if you want to go and talk about something else.
Let's skip to misconduct. I want to touch on this just briefly. It's interesting to me that Rule 8.4G expressly defines as misconduct in the ethical sense discrimination or harassment on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, etc., in the conduct of the practice of law. Comment 3 to that rule explains that discrimination and harassment by lawyers in violation of this rule undermine confidence in the legal profession and the legal system. So the not surprising lesson is that discrimination is professional misconduct. However, Rule 8.3 has a very high threshold for reporting misconduct to the bar. You have to know that the lawyer has violated the rule, has discriminated against somebody in the workplace, and that misconduct has to be at a level that raises a substantial question about the lawyer's honesty, trustworthiness, or fitness as a lawyer in other respects. And comment 2 tells us that substantial refers to the seriousness of the offense and not to the quantum of evidence. So unless a lawyer is pretty far down the road in overt discrimination, there's no professional obligation to report them to the bar for misconduct, for discrimination. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't report discrimination to your boss, to your manager, to a partner, or to HR.
I think we've about run out of time, but some questions that we should all ask ourselves as lawyers. Duty of competence, how do you use it? I think we've talked about that a little bit. Supervisory abilities based on your position to increase awareness among subordinates and the like. And what do you do when you see something that might be inappropriate? And with that, I think we have run out of time, although this is a topic we could have easily spent 3 or 4 hours on. Susan?
I want to say that Denton's declared this to be the year of allyship, and I'm proud of our firm for really working at that. We have had numerous opportunities, events, storytelling sessions. The workshop I attended yesterday was really great. They broke us into small groups, and we were asked to do things like create a bumper sticker of 5 words or less to describe what diversity and inclusion and allyship should do. In my group, there was a woman of color who said, you know, we all talk at each other in the workplace, but people don't really listen. I think that kind of working at allyship drives the organization to be much better. And with that, we will go to our next presentation on protecting confidentiality in litigation. Michelle, are
Susan,
you on the?
I'm here. Thank you. So Ron, Susan, you've already introduced yourself, so I will introduce myself. Thank you. I'm Michelle Gossmeyer. I am our Global Director of Information Governance, Risk, and Compliance. I've been with Denton's for a little over 10 years and in large global law firms for over 30. And I've had a wide range of roles centered around technology, security, and compliance. And I work closely with Susan and Ron and our lawyers and risk leaders all around the globe to focus on security and risk management. And I'm glad to be here.
So let's talk about the topics for today. We're going to begin with sources of obligations that we have as lawyers, deal with confidence and confidentiality, physical protection of confidentiality, which, Michelle, I don't know, we're in the world of electronics. Do we think about physical things as much as we should?
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the middle of the presentation, but absolutely, the physical component, even our electronics are stored somewhere physically, and our people and our offices are still in physical spaces that absolutely need to be considered and secured.
And then, of course, we have legal protection of confidentiality, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So it's nice to have everyone with us again.
There are so many sources of confidentiality obligations for lawyers that the slide is really superfluous. There are federal statutes and regulations, HIPAA for protection of personal health information, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act for financial institutions and their lawyers to protect sensitive customer information, the Fair Credit Reporting Act for consumer information, and many others. We also have the state level where privacy statutes are proliferating. There currently are privacy statutes covering consumer information of various types in California, Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, and Utah, and 12 other states have pending legislation for privacy to cover their citizens. And by the way, not to plug another law firm, but Squire Patton Boggs has a really great article on the internet called Preparing for 2023 State Privacy Law Compliance. There's a really nifty table in there that talks about the elements of the statutes in each state and compares them in categories. It's really a useful tool. We also have contractual obligations. Your company may be required to comply with industry standards for confidentiality security codes, security controls like ISO 27001, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or CIS, the Center for Internet Security, I can't even pronounce it, Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. This is why they go by acronyms. And then there's the grandfather of all personal privacy acts, the EU General Data Protection Regulation. as well as privacy statutes in other parts of the world.
Let's turn it back into the rules of professional conduct and our obligations there. Some basic rules, obviously 1.1, abreast of changes in law and its practice, including the benefits and risks of technology. And Susan, I think it's fair to say we can't talk about confidentiality without understanding technology.
Absolutely.
And then we have 1.4. This talking to clients, making sure the client understands to give informed consent and the like. These are some basics that we as lawyers have, whether in-house or retained counsel, to deal with confidentiality. Another basic obligation we have, obviously, 1.6, competence and confidentiality in the world today, to me, go hand in hand. You can't maintain confidentiality unless you're competent to understand the technology you're working with and what it is. And then we have also the various rules dealing with supervision. As a partner or supervisor attorney, what obligations do you have to see that the obligations are taken care of, so client information is protected and confidential information is protected?
Ron, if I can highlight one thing there that comes up quite often in our conversations is really the balance between security and convenience. So kind of that reasonable efforts, just because something is easier to do doesn't necessarily mean it's the most secure decision. So if it's easier to work on your home laptop or easier to email yourself documents at home, those can be a big violation of confidentiality, and it would be hard to defend reasonable efforts if your firm has processes in place to avoid against those types of things.
And in
Your
fact,
comment fits. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was saying our crack information security team has controls in place to monitor for that kind of behavior. I'm sorry, Ron,
Michelle,
you were
just
saying?
looking at this slide, I think part of the intersection, if you will, or interplay between what we have and the convenience of working are all the different ways we can communicate back and forth all the time. And I expect that's a major topic of security that needs to be looked at on a continuing, constant basis.
Absolutely. I mean, technology changes so quickly. And as we all saw over the last couple of years with the pandemic, right, many people went very quickly to remote working. We're using things like Teams and Zoom, technology that they may or may not have been as familiar with. So definitely staying current on how those function, how you store data, and how you deal with those systems are unfortunately another part of the requirement of practicing law nowadays.
So document
is-
has to be, sorry, I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just going to comment on something, but I'll leave it for you.
Word document used to mean a piece of paper. No longer, in fact, our firm is trying to move away from paper for all kinds of reasons, but there are paper documents still and electronic documents of many kinds, all of which may contain confidential information. Emails, text messages, IMs, images, recordings, all sources of risk for inadvertent disclosure of confidential information. And then we have storage locations and physical and electronic security issues. So there's on-site paper, there's off-site paper. People working remotely often print things and have them in their homes. On-site, there's storage in servers, workstations, laptops, all kinds of places. Third-party storage, documents at Iron Mountain, documents that may be in the possession of a vendor assisting in your legal services. And then we have removable media like cell phones, USB drives. Michelle can probably explain the hazards of those.
Yes, Susan, I mean, definitely as we've gone much more remote, again, right, we're trying to work from many places at all different times. So thinking about where we store that data and how accessible it is, really anytime you touch a computer, there is a chance that your data is going to be there. So if you're working on public computers, in hotels and other places like that, chances are when you open something or access it, there is a copy that may be put on that machine. So you really need to be thinking about any type of computers. If you're borrowing somebody else's computer or working from somebody else's home, really being very careful about those types of things. And then, as you said, removable media, those are very easy to lose, very easy to be accessed in many instances. So again, thinking about anytime you're plugging something in to an outlet or somewhere, you have to be thinking about what kind of connectivity and where that data might be going.
We at Denton's, and I'm sure many of you in the audience in your companies have basically blocked access for removable media unless you answer 8 questions and are approved for use of the removable media by both the Office of General Counsel and our information security people. And we don't permit bring your own devices unless they're protected by our particular software's mobile iron. But other than that, we do not permit them.
So let's talk a little bit about storage in the cloud, because that has become so pervasive, right? The whole debate when the cloud first came out in law firms, there was a huge concern about whether we would put our data in the cloud. What does it mean to let go of control of your data? So certainly cloud storage providers provide many benefits for data storage in today's complex world of technology. It transfers much of the work and the complexity to often more advanced teams. So companies that have huge tech teams and can work through some of the complexities. But it doesn't mean that you turn over responsibility of your data. Wherever you put it, you still have that responsibility, going back to technological competence. So when you store the data in the cloud, it's important to carefully vet providers and understand how they handle your data in multiple ways, some that are directly involving lawyers from a legal practice perspective, and others from a usability perspective. So 3 areas in particular. First, contractually, focusing on things such as what contract terms do you have with your cloud providers? How's the provider going to handle breach notification if your data is compromised? Will they notify you quickly? Will they share details with regulators or press before they let you know what happened? That can obviously create a very awkward situation. How your data will be handled after your business relationship is terminated with them, such as maintaining confidentiality or keeping your data secure, or will they return it or confirm the safe destruction? And how will they handle subpoena requests if there's a request to access your data for some reason as part of their larger overall footprint or specific to your data? Those are things you need to be aware of and how those are handled. Secondly, how they manage security controls. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into these in a few slides later. But where is your data stored if it goes with a provider? Is it in the originating country where you put the data there, or is it going to other countries offshore? That could be a risk or a concern depending on the type of data you're storing in the cloud. How they apply virus and malware protection, similar to what you do in your own firm or your organization. You need to make sure you understand how cloud providers are doing that carefully. How do they back up your data and ensure that it's recoverable if something were to happen and it was needed? How do they apply access controls to protect your data? Again, we'll dive a little bit deeper into access controls in just a bit. And how do they vet their employees? Do they run background checks? How do you make sure that the people that are going to have access to your data within those organizations are secure and carefully handling information? And thirdly, who else do they share your data with? So subcontractors, they have vendors, other providers, their employees. And how do they separate and secure your data from other clients? You need to make sure that there's not commingling, so that if they're giving other clients access to something, most cloud providers have covered this pretty well now. Now they've gotten up to speed. And many cloud providers such as Microsoft, Amazon, Google, they have great security teams, much larger and more technical than most law firms or other companies will have the ability to do. But you still need to vet those providers and know how they care for your data. Don't just assume because they're a large cloud provider that they are as secure as you need them to be. And some of those smaller cloud providers may not be handling security in the way that you have confirmed with your clients or your customers that you'd be doing. Susan, over to you.
As many of you know, in 2017, the ABA Standing Committee on Ethics and Professional Responsibility issued an update to its 1999 opinion on protecting the confidentiality of unencrypted email. Formal Opinion 477R expressly recognized the increasing sophistication of cyber threats and recognized that some new forms of electronic communication that become common may not always meet a reasonable expectation of privacy. The ABA at that time, 5 years ago, said that unencrypted email of routine matters remains an acceptable method of lawyer-client communication. I doubt many people in the audience would agree with that today. But the ABA provided some guidance that lawyers must, on a case-by-case basis, continually analyze how they communicate with clients and apply the factors that are set out in Model Rule 1.6 of Comment 18, including the sensitivity of the information, the likelihood of disclosure if additional safeguards are not employed, the cost and difficulty of implementing those safeguards, and the extent to which safeguards adversely affect the lawyer's ability to represent the clients, i.e., whether the electronic solution is too difficult for the client or the lawyer to use. Formal Opinion 477R was followed up in 2018 by another ABA opinion, 483. That opinion sets out the lawyer's ethical obligations following an electronic data breach or a cyber attack, where material client confidential information is misappropriated, destroyed, or otherwise compromised, or where the lawyer's ability to perform legal services is significantly impaired. In that opinion, ABA said that data breaches and cyber threats involving or targeting lawyers and law firms are a major professional responsibility and liability threat facing the legal profession. And we all know that now. The ABA also pointed out that compliance with privacy statutes, such as the state breach notification laws, HIPAA, Graham-Leach-Bliley, do not necessarily achieve compliance with ethical obligations. The ABA stated that compliance with the model rules depends on the nature of the cyber incident, the ability of the lawyer to know about the circumstances of the incident, and the lawyer's roles, level of authority, and responsibility for the law firm's obligations. Thereafter, the opinion sets out the various steps you need to take if you do experience a data breach that materially affects the client's information.
So in order to protect your information, Susan has just outlined the importance of that. There's a couple key components. You need to really know and understand what kind of data you have. So in understanding your practice, are you handling government contracts, healthcare related information, banking, financial information? Most law firms have a huge amount of highly sensitive information. So what data you have and where you have it. So organized storage systems, including clearly labeled folders and file naming conventions, are really critical to being able to inventory your data and make sure you understand how to protect it. It's really hard to protect unstructured information if it's not categorized properly. Even though technology is getting better at helping with this, there's still the human factor in being able to understand what you're doing with your data and how you're handling it. So if you think about maybe your personal financial records at home, if someone were to break in and steal your records, could you easily report what was stolen, mitigate the risk, and reconstruct your finances very easily? Now apply that concept to large, complex volumes of data in your organization and realize the importance of your technology teams and how that information is constructed and put together. Next slide, Susan, please. So classification of documents is very important, and I think really sets the stage for the majority of what Ron will cover a little bit later on. But a key part of proper storage is certainly classifying your data. So many technology systems have the ability to secure data based on the level of classification. By classifying or labeling the data, it can help you limit access to those who need it. And this is also known as the principle of least privilege. It's something that many law firms and other companies are seeing as requirements from insurance carriers, client obligations, making sure that you're minimizing or having fewest amount of people to have access to that information. The fewer people that have it, the less likely the data will be accidentally or maliciously exposed. So it's very similar to giving out keys to your front door. I'm not sure how many people even have keys to their doors anymore or codes to their security systems. But the more people who have the keys or the codes, the more people that can get in. So data classification also helps with searching, retaining, and destroying your data, helps you organize it at every stage of handling it. And again, goes back to that responsibility of properly handling client information. Next slide, please, Susan.
This is one of the reasons that we have people like Michelle in our organization, because since we have ethical obligations to protect confidentiality, in order to be technologically competent, we need to know everything that Michelle knows, which is not possible. So we associate in information security professionals to help us do this.
And keeping a fairly simple classification system really makes managing your data a lot easier. Sometimes there's a tendency to want to create too many levels of classification, really overcomplicates the world, and then makes it harder for people to choose how to best classify it. Also, administering these systems on the back end, the more complicated they are, the more it requires time, resources, and money to manage it. So if you look at this chart here, moving from left to right, the number of people with access should really be reduced based on the sensitive nature of the data. So public information, for example, such as your mission statement, really doesn't need to have specific security around it in the same way, because it's something that many people have access to and you actually want them to see it. Not so much the case if you've got merger and acquisition plans on your systems. So obviously you want to lock those down more securely. Proper classification is really, as we talked about earlier, balance of security and usability. If you restrict things too much, though, on the opposite end, people will try to work around your controls, such as we talked a little bit about, emailing or saving data outside of your systems, which you obviously don't want that to be the case either. So it all comes back to that duty of technological competence. Because it's easier is not necessarily a justification for lax security. And you'll find that, as we said, many of these controls really are required by your insurance carriers to get proper levels of coverage. And as we dive deeper and deeper into insurance coverage nowadays, it's getting harder and harder to get insurance coverage. And they do very deep dives on your security systems, your data handling processes, and they simply will just deny insurance coverage if you don't have these appropriate controls in place.
So we're once again at the stage where we need people to type in the code word in order to get CLE credit for this part of the presentation. For those of you who weren't here for the last hour, in the lower right-hand part of your screen, you'll see a box that says Q&A. You type the word confidentiality into that box and press send if you are from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Kansas. If your licenses are from one of those states, you must type that in to get credit. If not, you don't need to worry about this. So we'll give everybody a minute to do that.
And Susan, I noticed Kansas is not on our slide, so an extra shout out to make sure those people from Kansas are listening and typing in the word.
Good point. Okay, Michelle, tell us about access controls.
All right, so access controls, really what they do is help limit the access as needed to either perform job functions rather than giving more people access just for convenience. So 2 examples here might be HR related data, which is a type of data. As example, most people in your organization should not have access to the HR data, such as payroll, performance evaluations, benefits, or medical information. And even within your HR teams, you may want to limit the data only to those who need it, so that your payroll clerk may not necessarily have access to your medical data. Another example would be kind of a type of storage. So maybe a bank vault, if you think of it from that perspective, most people in the bank wouldn't have access to the vault, such as the cleaning staff or the maintenance crew. So giving access only to those who need access to the contents, again, focusing on that least privilege. This way, if an account or an individual is compromised, it limits access and helps reduce what can be taken. So the big message here really is resist the urge to give everyone access to all the files just in case they need it. I know historically in law firms, from a precedence perspective, it's been more of an open access system. That way you can search through and find all the different documents that were created, find precedents or other information. But as time has gone on, really that has become less of a good idea. And really locking down that material. Again, clients are asking for it. Many people on the line probably already seeing or hearing that, particularly if you do work for large financial institutions. They really want to make sure that everyone in the organization does not have access to their matter materials, but really lock down to the client or the matter team.
And then at Denton's, many of our clients require restriction of access to their documents to the matter team. We also have controls so that for any matter involving personal health information, the only people who have access are people from our healthcare practice group or other specific people who have matters involving PHI.
So as far as access controls, there are multiple ways to provide the ability to grant access to data and providing kind of that more purposeful access. There's different things you can assign rights to individuals or by groups, such as all managers or maybe all members of a client team, as Susan said, or maybe all people in the accounts receivable department. Access can also be granted based on maybe days of the week or times that people work. So people can only access data Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. I think most law firms probably don't focus on that quite as much because we work way more than 9 to 5 from Monday through Friday. But it's certainly something that you could do if you have contractors or people that don't need to have full-time access. And you can also control who has the ability to grant that access to others. So perhaps you want only the file owner to be able to grant access to others. As an example that Susan provided with healthcare, maybe people within the healthcare team can decide who else might need access to that on a need to know basis if they're working on something. But oftentimes your systems can be set up to put these controls in place so that you don't have to think too much about it and you just audit it or check it on a periodic basis. Certainly not everyone in your organization needs to fully understand all of these options. These are definitely left more for your tech teams, but knowing the options that exist help you understand and align with your duties of technological competence, realizing that your tech teams likely have put good thought and planning into your organization systems, set up procedures and policies. So taking time to learn them and follow them or raise the questions and suggestions where needed to make work flow a little bit more effective for you helps protect your data and your organization's reputation. And then tying back to Ron's very good question earlier, access controls don't only apply to electronic data, but also certainly to physical locations. So providing additional layers of protection, maybe where your data centers or your servers might still be stored in-house, you want to further protect those. So things such as card readers, code access doors, video cameras provide various levels of protection to your premises. Further safeguards your people, your data, and ultimately your business and your ability to provide more secure services. So having multiple layers helps mitigate the risk if one system should fail or be breached. Then, as Susan noted earlier, the likelihood of compromise is always looming. So taking the time to focus on prevention, although sometimes it can be kind of annoying, is way less painful than the time it takes to recover from data loss or a data breach. So Susan, over to you.
Confidentiality agreements are fine, and I'm sure most of you in your law firms or companies have them. Everyone should have them with employees, contractors, and any vendor who has access to confidential information of clients. But a contractual obligation to maintain confidentiality is low-level risk mitigation. There are much more active threats to confidentiality in the workplace. Social media, for example, is a significant threat. people get on social media and their brains stop thinking and they can easily inadvertently disclose confidential information. Denton's has largely cut off access to social media. If somebody wants access to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, they have to answer those 8 short questions and include the need for and duration of their access. For example, our trademark infringement practice, they do need to, in particular matters for particular periods of time, have a paralegal look through Facebook or look through Twitter and see if their mark is appearing somewhere it shouldn't. But that approval is given only by the Office of General Counsel in consultation with our information security team. Michelle talked about remote working. I'm sure everybody has at this point remote working requirements and restrictions in place, but working remotely is also an inherent threat to confidentiality. For example, few people in their homes have the same kind of physical security for printed documents that we do in the workplace. And although we and your organizations periodically remind people of their obligations to maintain security when they work at home, it's much easier for people at home to have a lapse. Reporters are a hazard, or more specifically, lawyers who talk to reporters are a hazard. Faced with an aggressive or really interested reporter, people can slip up and say things they shouldn't that are confidential to clients. At our firm, nobody talks to a reporter without express permission from our communications organization, who wants to see what they're going to say, and again, the Office of General Counsel. And the most important risk avoidance method is training for employees. I'm sure many of you have mandatory annual security training. Certainly we do. Michelle and her organization have worked hard to come up with really interesting and involving modules that very well illustrate the kinds of risks posed by phishing attempts, what they look like, what you should do if you're a target of a phishing attempt, or urgent texts from somebody senior to you, which I will admit I once fell for because I wasn't thinking. We train people not only through our annual security training, but by periodic risk tips from our general counsel and in reminders during Zoom conferences with various populations of our people. Michelle, you're very expert on that whole subject. Anything else you want to add?
Yes, Susan, I think I would, as you said, risk tips, it reminded me, I mean, it doesn't have to be dry, dull, and boring content, right? I mean, not all of this is as exciting to others as it is to Susan and I, who live and breathe this and call ourselves, I guess, data and security geeks. But our risk tips are a great example of that, right? Our Office General Counsel sends out risk tips, and they include lots of humorous, funny, it might be movie clips, it might be something funny with song lyrics, anything that's going to catch the person's attention and remind them and have it kind of a stickiness to realize and understand what that important security lesson in really lasts a lot longer and goes a lot further. And if you can incorporate it into something where you're not only protecting firm and client systems, but also protecting their systems at home, that also goes a long way in making it more important to them. We've had lawyers come back to us and say, I was talking about the risk tip or my training over dinner with my family, and we have a question. That is great for us because it means that they're absorbing it, they're sharing it. The more they share it at home, that means more people in their home are going to protect their systems and the things that happen when they're working there. So lots of good things that you can do to make it a little bit more interesting.
Ron, can you talk with us about legal protection for confidentiality in litigation?
Two of you were spending most time talking about internal confidentiality and the like. How do we maintain and protect client confidences and firm information and the like? I think, though, we need to move a little bit and talk about us or the client versus the outside world. And you see the protections on the left. Have to be careful when we're collecting and producing documents. And Susan, we could spend an hour talking about document review and how that should be dealt with to avoid the inadvertent disclosure of information. There are ways to put limitations on discovery. That blends into protective orders, where there is a control on how many people get to see things, as they have to be produced in discovery. Another way to put a limit on discovery to deal with confidentiality concerns is to raise them and ask the court to, among other things, phase discovery. So certain information is not inquired into at a certain time. And if it is, a protective order is put in place. And then, of course, we have sealing orders. Sealing orders are, I think it's fair to say, the hardest to get. There may be requests to seal filings with the court. There also may be, beyond that, even requests to file proceedings themselves, for example, hearings. And that goes over to the risks, and we have the First Amendment issues involved, where we are guaranteed freedom of the press and effectively certain rights of access. And then, of course, we have a long tradition of common law dealt pre-revolutionary times that talks about courts being public institutions and accountable to the public. And that's where a lot of the concepts of protections versus risk come from, because the default in the United States is it's public. And if we want to keep it from that, barring a statute that protects certain type of information, for example, information about sexual abuse victims and the like, the odds are that information that's going to a court or that's talked about in court is going to be available to the public. So I think that's a quick overview, Susan, as to the protection and risks that exist for any type of information that is exchanged or used in some type of public forum. This is the general rule under 26 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, and you're going to see equivalents of this throughout the states with different language. 26B talks about discovery of anything relevant to a claim or defense and proportional to the needs of the case. Proportionality is something that can be raised when there is confidential information in issue, and an argument is made to the court that this information may undue burden, delay, or the like, should be deferred until another time rather than turned over. We also have this language at the end about relevant information need not be admissible at trial. The discovery appears reasonably calculated to lead to the discovery of admissible evidence. We could spend an hour talking about that. Effectively, what that means is you can get discovery into something even if it's hearsay. Hearsay may not be admissible, but it doesn't mean it's not discoverable. And then, of course, we have the party withholding discovery, a privilege claim. This is something where we often see issues about, Susan, where a party wants to withhold something and they don't describe it enough so adversaries get to raise objections to what's not being produced and the like. And on the privilege side, for example, that would simply mean we need privilege logs so that the other side can see what we're withholding and why. But this is, generally speaking, under the rules, what we look at, the first rule when we're talking about discovery of confidential information.
And for those of you who don't know Ron, he is truly an expert in this area. He's not only an e-discovery expert who our firm uses all the time, but he's a former magistrate judge. So he's lived all of these principles and rules.
And there are a lot to think about beyond what's in the rules, Susan. But it's a fascinating topic. I know the two of you love to talk about it, and so do I. And there is such a lot out there. This is the protective order. This is Rule 26C. Pretty simple. We talked about this a little bit before. This is the protective order, and you'll see the reasons why one may be secured, and there can be information not being disclosed at all, or limitations on disclosure. Same thing with deposition transcripts. There may be a deposition of an inventor or someone who's going to be talking about a trade secret that should not see the light of day for the public because it is a trade secret, and disclosure of the trade secret destroys its value, as well as any confidentiality, then go with it. This is another way to address, if you will, proportionality, not the original test as to whether or not discovery should be allowed, but factoring proportionality into protective orders and the like to limit disclosure. And now, going to the First Amendment right of access, alluded to this before, First Amendment, freedom of the press, usually we'll talk about that in a little while, who enforces the First Amendment. Often when a party is trying to keep information protected, the press comes as a surrogate to the public to ask for access. And then you'll also see the second bullet point or the first bullet point about the right to receive information is a corollary to the First Amendment. So we've seen a lot of Supreme Court case law, more on the criminal side than the civil side, involving First Amendment rights of access. Common law right of access, and you see we have a citation to a recent decision from the 11th Circuit. Essential element of our system of justice. I mentioned this before. This has to do with the public getting to know how courts function and accountability of courts to the public. It only attaches to information that's public or a judicial record, not everything that might be produced in discovery. One of the first modern Supreme Court decisions that talked about this was Seattle Times, basically saying discovery is a private event. And if people exchange information or parties exchange information, that doesn't mean there's a public right of access to it. And then you'll see discovery materials can be judicial records when they're filed in connection with a motion. And the circuits really have a number of tests to formulate the motions that the right of access attaches to, but they all boil down to if they're put in a court record, something available to a court to look at in making a decision, got to assume they're confidential. And then of course, we have this balancing test under the First Amendment. If I am representing a client in litigation and there's a trade secret involved, there's something else, and I don't want disclosure, I have to explain the harm that will be visited on me. And then, of course, there's the public interest that another party might be raising, or an intervener, such as a press organization, might be raising. This is the Seattle Times decision I mentioned before. This talks about discovery being a private event, and if information is being exchanged that a party wishes to keep confidential, the attorney for the party will go in front of the judge if no agreement can be reached with the other side and secure a protective order so that there is no disclosure, at least until the information becomes public, as going in with the substantive motion with an argument that the information should still not be disclosed, or if there's an argument being made that there's a hearing and the public should not be allowed into it for one reason or another.
And underlying this, of course, is the very broad scope of discoverable information, which is any information that is potentially relevant to the litigation. So there are potentially enormous numbers of documents exchanged in discovery that aren't going to be germane to the lawsuit and should not be public records until they're used in connection with the substantive motion.
And I think picking back up to something you two spoke about before, and that's electronic information, that has so expanded concerns about confidentiality and the like, just because of the sheer volume of information that comes in all the time, Susan. And I'm sure that was the question I asked you, Michelle, basically. How do you reconcile all these interests internally when you're coming up with your cybersecurity, your privacy controls?
Yeah, and I mean, a key part to that, Ron, is certainly, not just IT and security people sitting in a corner and deciding all on their own, but really sitting down. I mean, we spend significant amount, we meet regularly with Susan and our GC and risk leaders on a very regular basis to understand the risks of the business, how business and work is flowing, sitting down with practice teams, going to their practice meetings and understanding where are their challenges, how are things changing, and working the systems and the processes along with the workflow so that it's a collaborative effort. And even having those conversations with your clients as well. It's a great opportunity to discuss with clients what kind of data are you exchanging? How can you best make that process effective? A lot of people on the line may be involved in or may have been some way involved in like client security audits or assessments, as an example, for law firms. We take those as great opportunities to have conversations with our clients. It's not just a check the box exercise to get past the security assessment, but truly understanding, what is it that you're looking for from us as a law firm? How can we most effectively work together to secure our data collectively as an industry and just as a whole? So conversations, kind of tying back into the allyship discussions, right? Communication, conversations, always important to just get those out on the table and have those discussions.
I'm glad you
Susan, we
mentioned
need
that.
to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I sometimes sit in on the Zoom calls between our clients' security auditors and our information security team to respond to assessments. And although I understand very little of what they're saying to each other, because it's far beyond my technological understanding, as Michelle says, it's a really important element of making sure that what our clients want at a very specific level in terms of electronic security is what we're providing.
As lawyers, when we're talking to our clients, I think it's fair to say, and Susan, you can correct me on this, there are a lot of levels of conversations that we need to have with you, the client. Number one, we have the basic understanding of what you want from us and what kind of data we're going to be getting to do our jobs and to give advice, including representing a client in litigation or before a regulatory agency. And then number two, we need to understand the nature of the data just so we can undertake the analysis that Michelle was talking about before, so we know what the data is and how do we manage it properly. And that's a place where a lot of those other conversations come in. And then we have another conversation if we're in litigation, and if not in litigation, of which is exchanging information, perhaps for contractual purposes of the like. What's the information that's being exchanged? What controls are there in the information? What agreements are being entered into with regard to the information? So there are a lot of components, I think, to this entire issue of confidentiality, both internally between us and a client and externally, if you will, when we're dealing in litigation or regulatory investigation. And of course, that's a major focus now too, because there are a lot of federal and state agencies that are very interested in cybersecurity and privacy these days. Something else, let me go back to that last one, if you don't mind, for a second. Susan, something to think about here. Prior restraints, it's really not something that we should be concerned about with, at least now, because if we're restricting information or courts restricting information is different than an attempt to prohibit publication. Primarily, I think it's fair to say when the press wants to publish something. And a prior restraint basically is an ex parte control on what can be published without some type of adjudication. It's something to think about, important about. It's got to do with suppression of expression, different than what we're talking about now. Criminal proceedings. There are instances where our clients are going to have some issues regarding criminal proceedings and the like, maybe witnesses or whatever. But First Amendment right of access is enshrined in Supreme Court case law. This press enterprise case is probably one of the leading ones about it. And that's the significant role that the public access plays and seeing that things work right in our society and under our Constitution. And you'll see here about when things should be public. And we have the question here about where in the process. Grand jury materials, grand jury proceedings, traditionally not public, because the public does not get access to the internal workings, if you will, of a grand jury. Juror selection, yes, because the public has an interest in knowing that jurors are selected fairly and the like. And then preliminary hearings, we could go back and forth on that. The maybe is there because it depends, which is the lawyer's answer to most of everything. Preliminary hearings, again, public observation and criminal justice system, we talked about that. The need for public access because there is no jury, if you will. But then, of course, we have this question of weighing values. And you'll see the test is in red. Courts have to make specific findings here of prejudice to a defendant that closure would prevent, and there are no reasonable alternatives. But this, Susan, is something that when we're in this world of confidentiality is very important to think about, and that's the proofs that have to be made. We as lawyers need to be able to have conversations with our clients. What do you have, and what values are enshrined in it that you're concerned about? And what can we do to protect those values? But even more importantly, how do we show that to a court? And that may be affidavits usually, may even be, there've been situations where I presided over them. We have to have hearings with live witnesses because the other side wants to be able to cross-examine something that's said.
So I have a question for you. What do you, as an expert in security, consider to be an organization's biggest external threats to client confidential information?
Biggest external threat to client confidential information. I don't know that I have one answer to that, unfortunately. Going back to Ron's point, right? It depends, I guess, is the safest answer. But there's multiple things, right? I mean, oftentimes much of what you hear is, the usability, right? So the user and understanding what and how to deal with the information. But certainly the technological controls that a firm has in place. So there's just very, very basic things that hopefully many firms have in place, things that we've already talked about. You touched on data encryption and blocking different types of ways that risks and vulnerabilities can get into a firm, or how data can be exfiltrated from a firm. So really just kind of working with your technology and your security teams, if you don't already have the types of things that we talked about in place, and understanding, again, that conversation about what are you holding and how do you control it and how do you make sure that it's secured.
And as we all know, and sort of contrary to what you might think, lawyers and law firms, which do not make up a great percentage of businesses, are really attractive targets for cyber attacks because we have, or at least are perceived to have, treasure troves of valuable information. So for law firms, I think the bar is pretty high for implementing really solid electronic security controls. And my opinion, Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that internally the biggest threat to cyber protection are our people, because people need to be trained, they need to be disciplined. We now have a really helpful red line that shows up on external emails. So this is an external email. Wake up. But it's an ongoing struggle. And I think the more training that everybody can do for their personnel in as many modes as possible and with the reasonable frequency, it's the best protection you can get against the threat that people will push that button, open that attachment, and let a fisher in.
Absolutely. I think two things that you said, Susan, resonate for sure. Firms absolutely are targets. I remember I was at a conference in another industry a couple of years ago, and people that work outside of law firms don't necessarily always understand completely what happens inside of a law firm. And they were surprised that we had law firm people at the security conference. And they said, now, why would a law firm have to be concerned about security? Now, again, this was several years ago. But the way we explained it was, well, if you think about it, if I were an attacker or somebody that wanted information, I can go to, bank ABC or healthcare organization XYZ or government contract place, DEF, or I can go to the law firm that represents all of them. And if I can get into the law firm, I can get the data from all of those at the same time. Again, if the systems aren't secure. So as to your point, I mean, treasure troves of information constantly based on who we represent, what we do. Law firms are constantly attacked. Most large firms will tell you that they get threat attempts hundreds or thousands of times a day trying to get into their firewalls and into their systems, very actively attacked on a very regular basis. So this stuff is very, very real. It's not just stuff we put in place because it sounds good or because we want to figure out how to keep our jobs. They're very, very active threats that happen on a regular basis. It's no shortage of press information that talks about that, law firms in the press, losing data, having issues. And the other part to it, Susan, I think to your point is the human side of it, right? Just because we operate in such a high pressure deadline environment, right? There's huge amounts of pressure. And that's when people make their largest mistakes, is when they're pressured into something. They don't have a lot of time to think. I mean, I know you gave examples in the past before, right? Where it doesn't take more than a second to do that click and before you realize that you've done something wrong. So when your guards are down because you're working really late hours, or you've got a really pressure-filled deadline, that's when might most likely want to cut those corners, do something that maybe isn't the right thing to do. So to your point, just continuing to educate people and have leadership fully support, which happens at our firm quite a bit, I'm proud to say, right? Leadership understands the value of security and fully supports people if they, raise their hand, they have something doesn't seem right, I'm concerned. Take that time to track it down and understand what's happening before you make that mistake.
And before we close, Ron, can you just tell us a little bit about the Sedona Conference, which I personally find to be an unbelievably rich source of information about these kinds of issues?
The Sedona Conference is a think tank, and I'll confess to self-interest in it. I do a lot with Sedona. I've written things with them times, including some materials with regard to what we're talking about today. To what you're talking about, Sedona is actually published in Law Firm Security. Sedona is something that anyone can join. For X dollars, you can become a member of Sedona. But I think even more interestingly for everyone listening in, any document that Sedona's published is freely available. You just need to go to the website. We have documents on any one of a number of topics. Electronic discovery and information is one of the central points that Sedona looks at all the time. So there's a lot from there that's available that any one of a number of attendees may find of interest if they want to get a little more detail into what we've been talking about today.
And with that, I would like to thank our panelist, Ron Hedges, who put together both panels. It's quite a lot of work. Karen Jordan and Mukul Kelkar for the Allyship panel, and Michelle Gossmeyer for our Confidentiality panel. And thanks to everyone in the audience for participating in our CLE seminar. I want to remind people that if you've signed up for this, or if you're in those 4 states and typed in the code word, you will get your CLE credit, your CLE certificate in about 30 business days through an email with a link, which you can open. Your webinar login details will be used to process the certificates. There are no added steps required. And thank you for joining us, and have a great day.